500 years of fighting and martyrdom would seem a great weight to bear for a young kid from a rural Punjabi village, or indeed a high school student in the United States or Canada. But there is a great sense of joy and warmth that permeates that Sikh militant community in the West, which seems to overcome thoughts of suffering and death. How can people with so much violence all around them be so happy and so seemingly at peace with themselves? The name of one of the expatriate Khalistani newspapers, Chardi Kala, gives a hint here. Chardi Kala means rising spirits, and it is a sense of boundless optimism that braces and invigorates someone who has chosen the path of Guru. The rising spirits of the Guru-oriented Sikh stem from the dual exercise of spiritual and temporal power, Miri and Piri, that reinforce and enhance one another in an escalating cycle. Prayer and action, action and prayer. Through one, a Sikh becomes stronger in the other. As in the case of the militants who were described as handling their weapons as if in worship, or in the case of the guerrilla who listened to hymns while going on combat missions, sometimes they are one and the same thing. Rising spirits means, really, empowerment, to which both religion and politics, as we all know, contribute. In some traditions these kinds of power are seen as parallel, in some as totally separate. In the militant interpretation of Sikhism, they are identical. The feeling of Chardi Kala is also one of liberation. I was in Jodhpur jail, but I was free as a bird, one Sikh reported. And like Islam, a religious tradition with an equally prominent tradition of martyrdom, Sikhs who die in battle do not look forward to an eternal life in paradise. Resistance to perceived injustice is an existential stance for the militant Sikh, something one does as meaningful in itself. I resist, therefore I am, wrote Campus, in a similar spirit. One doesn't necessarily expect to get something out of it, either for oneself or even for one's movement. Although Sikh history contains ample elements of both resistance to power and complicity with power, it is in postures of resistance that Amritsari Sikhs today feel most fully at home, most fully Sikh. The Khalsa either rules or is in resistance, they say, harking back to Guru Gobind Singh's motto, Raj Karige Khalsa. Since they are not ruling, there is no other stance to take than that of resistance, even if the resistance has little immediate chance of success. Militants perceive that they simply have no other option but to continue in resistance as a meaningful and style in itself. Those hoping to contain the militancy are in for a long haul, for resistance is tied to the very identities, both personal and spiritual, of the militants. There is a further and more enigmatic component of Sikh militant consciousness, however, centered on the notion of love. Life was a game of love, as Guru Nanak put it, is a rather different life to the one most of us experience, and is certainly not what we typically envision as characteristic of guerrilla fighters, but captured by photographers in poses of militancy, holding AK-47s. Bandoliers across the shoulder. The martyred militants are regularly described as gentle, quite soft, and full of love. Other observers of guerrillas have made similar, problematic, assertions. They died of an excess of love, wrote Yeats in reference to the Irish uprising of 1916. Let me say, with the risk of appearing ridiculous, says Che Guevara, that the true revolutionary is guided by strong feelings of love. It is impossible to think of an authentic revolutionary without this quality. The union of the kettle to feed the hungry and the sword to defend the weak in Sikh symbolism, the Deg Tipach motto, is expressive of the relationship between violence and charity in Sikh theology. A British-reared Sikh who visited the Golden Temple complex shortly before Operation Blue Star made this instructive comment. From a Dean Shaver perspective, from a European perspective that is, things must have looked a bit dodgy at the Akal takhat. There were a lot of weapons around. But for Sikhs, we know that Sikhism actually came out of a weapon. If you look at the Guruduwara, what does it have on top? A hamda, double-edged sword. We know that this emphasis on weapons is entirely from a defensive perspective. It is not a symbol of hate for us but a symbol of love. So when I saw my relatives standing around there with guns, I thought, well, they must have a good reason for it. A clean-shaven person might see it differently, of course. The steel wristbands worn by Sikhs carry multiple meanings for individuals involved in militancy, and the truth is pure steel metaphor is only one of them. Another facet of the symbolism of the kara is the notion that the bracelet handcuffs the wearer to the world. It is a bond of love, one militant told me. Not only to my brothers and sisters of the Panth but to all human beings. We can't express our faith through renunciation, another said. Being a Sikh is entirely tied to being in the real world. It's a link forged by steel, unbreakable. Although the universalist sense of common ground with all people permeates Sikh rhetoric, like that of the militant who talked about fighting in Bosnia and Somalia to support the UN. The bond of siblinghood among initiates to the Khalsa is the most concrete expression of this love of the Sikhs. When sisters are sexually dishonored, brothers react with anger and shame. Men frequently remember not their own experience of torture in prison but the cries of comrades, women not their own rapes but the insults to their sisters, mothers, and daughters. The portrait of Sucker and Jinder, hanged for the assassination of General Vader, that many militants have hanging on their walls shows not their martial valor but their comradely love. Squatting down, arms about each other's shoulders, they look like the young boys they in fact were, not much like fearsome assassins. The tight bond of solidarity among comrades in arms accounts for much of the courageous behavior of Sikh militants in the field and contributes to the cycles of killing and revenge killing that escalated so quickly in Punjab. I suggest that the immediacy of the sense of siblinghood with others in the Panth affects the behavior of Sikh militants in two other significant ways. The first relates to the torture situation, in which, as Elaine Scary points out insightfully, the major effect is the radical narrowing of the world of the victim to the space of the pain inflicted, with a corresponding widening of the world of the torturer, which becomes hegemonic. Resistance to torture, or more accurately, ability to survive torture, depends heavily on the victim's hold on a world wider than his or her pain, and it is in this context that the handcuffed quality of a Sikh to the world becomes critically important. One may, out of adherence to principle and individual courage, refuse to talk under torture. But surviving it with spirit intact depends on the ability to physically and mentally reject the narrowing of one's world that is the ultimate aim of the torture enterprise, and the elevated attention to the cries of a cellmate or the shame of a sister one hears in narratives of Sikh militants, are best understood as part of this attempt to retain a shred of a space, a world, beyond and outside of one's own searing, demanding pain. A tradition that celebrates community bonds is one, in fact, with the latent capacity to mobilize these bonds as a form of resistance, and in the Khalistani insurgency we see this mobilization effected at all levels. When we come to the ultimate physical affront, death, the capacity of bonds of love to mold individual experience are at their strongest. A death conceived as martyrdom turns what looks like defeat into victory. The individual died, but in his or her bloody witness the truth lives on, the individual died.